Collins & Co.'s not-for-profit conference, Be Empowered Through Knowledge, is designed specifically for the not-for-profit sector. Our speakers are experts in this sector, and their practical approach provides not-for-profit board members and management with the opportunity to improve their skills and knowledge across a range of specialist topics. The conference also provides a great networking opportunity.
Ross is a leading social impact practitioner, researcher and strategist who advises industry, the community sector and government on impact measurement, strategy and policy. He's the founding director of the specialist consultancy Think Impact. Their mission is to increase social impact literacy through working with clients to know, show and grow their social impact. Ross's topic today is From Mendicants to Masters of Change, how great impact measurement and communication can transform your struggling non-for-profit into a for-purpose powerhouse. Please welcome Ross.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you very much for sticking around for the day, and I promise a interesting and challenging session, and also because we're a bit of a small group, feel free to pipe up and ask questions as we go. Look, the first thing I want to do is kind of reclaim the word impact. Following the last presentation, it's not about nuclear explosions, and nor is it about marketing impact. We're talking about something very specific when we talk about impact, and that's, of course, about the change that results from the efforts of the not-for-profit sector. I also want to correct a couple of other things too. The not-for-profit sector is not risk-averse. We have here 15% of the workforce earning 3% of the income and doing a great job on actually challenging some of society's biggest issues. About our organisation, I used to head a charity called Starlight Children's Foundation, and one day at a board meeting, one of our directors said to me, "What do we do here, Ross?" And I said, "Well, we brighten the lives of seriously ill children." And he said, "How do we measure units of brightness? How do you know you're making a difference?" Being the smart ass that I was and am, I said lumens, because that is a measure of brightness for the physicists amongst you. But of course we didn't know. We were raising $19 million a year without really understanding the degree to which we were making change. And I knew that my counterparts in disability employment or bowel cancer prevention or domestic violence, tackling domestic violence, were making more impact, but weren't being able to attract the money because that was the way the money was being allocated. So I set apart and I went around the world and started looking around at better ways of doing this, and came across the New Economics Foundation in the UK and started doing some work with them, and then through set up an organisation called Net Balance, which got acquired by EY, and now we have Think Impact. And really our mission is really trying to reshape and reframe what we mean by prosperity as a nation, and it's quite a serious issue because really, it's only by understanding the impact that we make and doing a better job of communicating it and really helping organisations to transform the degree to which they create positive impact and mitigate their negative impact, can we really hope to transform what we think of when we think of progress and prosperity in a country or even globally. Bit of context here. Australia's a pretty wealthy nation, right? Look, we don't have that many problems compared to others. Those quick amongst you, that's the OECD poverty rates, the half median method of relative poverty, and we sit right about there, just next to Greece. We actually do have some fairly significant problems in Australia, and we kind of like delude ourselves around how wealthy we actually are, and we have very high levels also of homelessness. 1 in 200 people every night. That's 108. There's enough people to fill this ground, actually. Actually a bit more, 108,000 people every night don't have what we would call a secure housing to live in each night. And the gap in equity is widening, and this is not looking like changing in the near future, certainly with the current approaches. So we have some real challenges ahead of us, and there are some elephants in the room around all this stuff. First of all, there is a preponderance of organisations who are doing good. Most of you are from them. 600,000 in Australia at last count. They're not-for-profits. 30,000 are economically significant registered charities. The efforts of those organisations are largely disconnected and fragmented. They do not play well together. There's good reasons for that too, and that's the funding structures that we approach forces them into competitive funding. I'm delighted to say I'm actually doing some work now with some of the larger government departments on actually changing that competitive model, which will be great. There's a substantial amount of input, about $120 billion a year goes into the sector with very little understanding of the actual change that results from that. The design of programs, as you know, is largely driven by fundraising attractiveness and political expediency and a whole bunch of other things. And we really need, and there's a whole group of organisations like us and organisations like yours who are working to change that. And despite, or perhaps because of this, there is still an overwhelming level of poverty and disadvantage in Australia, one that we can't really, given our resource base and everything else and our background, we can't really sit around and accept any longer. And if I sound a bit angry about this sometimes, I do. It actually is quite, I find it, we've kind of forgotten. We now, 10 years ago, if you saw a teenager on the street homeless, there'd be kind of everyone would rush around. Now we just kind of walk past. We have changed, and we're continuing to change. And we still struggle to make economic and policy decisions based on non-economic terms. And so part of our role, of course, is to increase the level of understanding of these non-economic measures and of things like well-being. And our definition of prosperity does include wealth and well-being and how we combine those two things. Anyway, I did quite deliberately put in this silly word, mendicant. What is a mendicant? A mendicant is one who relies on charity. It's a very ancient word, but our entire not-for-profit sector relies on charity. So the first thing we would like to do is ban the term not-for-profit. No one really cares that you don't make a profit. As a matter of fact, it's one of the most easy things you can do in life. You just spend as much as you earn and job done. We would much rather we thought of ourselves as a sector, as a for-purpose sector. So that's one of the first things, and the roadmap to this new version of prosperity in the sector. That slide looks really rubbishy, doesn't it? But anyway, the first step is about banning the word not-for-profit. You're the only sector that describes itself by what it isn't. And I would love us to start to think about, just as a for-profit organisation is very focused on developing profit, a for-purpose organisation has just as much right to be very focused on its purpose and should be able to measure and report on the degree to which it delivers on its purpose. I'm also very proud to say, by the way, we've just finished our certification as a B Corp, so we are now a Benefit Corp. So we sit between not-for-profit and for-profit, or for-purpose and for-profit. See, even I can't break the habit. The second thing we're going to talk about is how to articulate a good theory of change. So if you are going to think about reporting on the degree to which you achieve your purpose, how are you going to deliver on that purpose? And that is a critical piece in this. It's not enough to just be doing good. It needs to be thought through. The problems that we all tackle are so challenging and so complex that they need a much more sophisticated way of thinking through that. The role of stakeholders, listening hard to stakeholders. And we're going to show you the voice of some people that we've just finished a film for fairly recently in a minute. And so the role that they play in actually designing the solutions in Australia has a wonderful history of designing solutions for especially Aboriginal people where the Aboriginal people aren't involved and haven't been involved in the process, and we've all seen the outcomes of that over 200 years. We need to be able to provide evidence, And then, the hard bit, we need to engage a whole ecosystem around these social problems. Funders, other organisations that have mutually reinforcing tasks and actions and a whole bunch of other things. So that's what we're going to talk about and share some ideas about how we might be able to do that. And by the way, I'm fortunate enough to be heading over to Istanbul in a couple of weeks to share some of this stuff and learn also from Social Value International about how some of the international approaches that are being adopted on this. So I'm looking forward to bringing that back soon. From not-for-profit to for-purpose, how do we make that transition? Well, I got challenged once to see, could I explain that in 3 slides? And I've had a crack, so here we go. This is how we think we work. We're out there, we're competing for funding, and the more funding enables us to deliver our programs, and we create social impact that we love to measure and tell a good story. Yep, it makes good sense. How we're actually working is that the funding too often is driving the program design. Someone says, hey, I've got some funding for a drug and alcohol program in Frankston, and yep, we can do that, and off we go and we run that, and I've got some funding to save polar bears, and yep, we can do that. And so what's happened to the sector is that the survival is trumping the mission. And the benefits are actually quite mixed now, that a lot of benefit flows into the activity rather than into the thing that you're trying to change. We have a massive system, and as several speakers I have heard earlier say that there are several organisations that probably shouldn't exist anymore. But we do what we do, and we've done it for many years, and we like to keep doing it, and we're not really challenging ourselves hard on designing ourselves around the impact that we intend to create. So what we're suggesting is how we should work is actually through a process we describe as impact-led design. So we design the whole sector, we design organisations around the impact that they create, not around the activities that they undertake. And that creates much more effective interventions and maximises social impact. But of course, we all like to be a learning organisation as well, so we learn from our evaluation rather than using evaluation. So some people describe it as it's like a lamppost. You know, you can use it for illumination or support, and too often we use it to support our current activities, and good measurement actually helps us illuminate the way that we're creating change and change, and most importantly indeed is engage the funders in that conversation. So no longer are we mendicants, no longer are we saying we have a need that we like to serve. We serve homeless people here, or we do this thing over there, or we do that there. We have a need because that's the need that we exist for. So please funders give us money to do that, and they never give us enough, and as a result we have this kind of growing inequity and challenge in our society. Wouldn't it be great if we could actually engage on equal terms, be the holders of the information, and be, as I describe in the topic, in the title of this presentation, be masters of change. And that's really what we are, and what we should think about ourselves. We are for-purpose masters of change, not mendicants who rely on charity and the goodness of others to do the work that we happen to think is important. So, a couple of things. How do we redefine success? Well, first of all, how do we live as a for-purpose organisation? A couple of basic premises. First of all, redefine success. It's not about success we don't measure by our fundraising growth. We shouldn't. I know we do. From money in, but it's really, we're much greater focus on the impact generated. So that's what success means for our organisations. We know our purpose, and we know the degree to which we are delivering on it. We know it well. We know the intricacies of it. We know who else is working on it. We don't just kind of... I saw a wonderful presentation from an English guy whose name escapes me for the minute, but he said, can you imagine what it would be like in an antisocial sector? How would an antisocial sector behave? They would just tell the good stories. They would hide the bad stuff. They would polish their organisation so they look like they were doing lots of good stuff. They wouldn't report transparently on impact. And he goes on, and it's a wonderful kind of thing. You sort of sit there and cringe and realise, oh my God, that's what we do. So we know our purpose. We recognise that trying hard isn't good enough. You know, it's not about doing the best we can. It's about solving problems. And in short, sort of knowing the change that we're seeking to create, and very, very importantly, how we can actually create that change. And we'll finish up, by the way, with some frameworks about how we're approaching outcomes, not as a list of things that we achieve, but as a complex system that works together, and that will be hopefully useful. Okay, theories of change. What are they? How do they work? Well, here's the most basic one. You've all seen it, I hope. Kellogg's Foundation developed it in the 1970s. They call it a logic framework. Inputs, if you've got, put a little if-then between each of the box. If you get these inputs, then you can do these activities. If you do these activities, then you can produce these outputs. If you can do these outputs, you can create this change, which we call outcomes. If you create enough of those outcomes, we can create some long-term, broad societal impact. I just thought I'd quickly share with you some actual ones that have been done and some that we've been involved in. Sorry, this is a little bit hard to see. Don't worry too much about it. This is Fair Finance Australia. It's a project we did a couple of years ago. But really it was about what happens when you... Don't try and read all the boxes. I'll just try and explain the three big boxes there. What happens if you provide fair and appropriate finance to people rather than allow them to be dependent on fringe lenders? Almost as popular with me as gambling organisations are with the previous speaker. The first thing that they talk about to us, and when you engage stakeholders and you find out what's really changed, breathe again. They talk about reduced anxiety. That's one of the real most valuable benefits to them, that I can actually breathe again. I don't feel like I've been hit by a truck every day. I can actually make some better decisions. The bottom area is around increased self-esteem. For some people, and there's quite a large proportion, I think 7 or 8% of Australia are what's called underbanked. They've never had a bank account other than one that they have to get their Centrelink benefits, and their only relationship is through a machine, which they don't realise they're paying, another effective, getting $20 out at a time, so there's another 10% tax on the $2 fees each time. But actually being able to walk into a bank, and as someone said to us, it's like the first time I've been able to walk into a bank and people don't look at me like I'm about to rob it. Only then the top part is the improved quality of life. The point of that slide is really just saying that when we're looking at a finance program, we're not just about measuring, return rates and rates of return and default rates and other things. We're looking much more deeply at non-financial change that results in that. There's a whole bunch of ways you can do it. There's no great rules here. I'm not going to go through all of these. You can express the theory of change, but make sure you do the work to think through how you actually create change. Some organisations love a much more structured framework that's usually referred to as a log frame or a logic frame, based on that very first slide. One of the things that we find troublesome about that, if that's the approach that your organisation is very rarely do you see causal links between the activities that we're doing and the outputs. We just kind of say, here's a list of stuff that happens that we call inputs and activities and outputs and outcomes, and we don't really fully understand the interactivity and the causal links between them, which is why we kind of like people to work on some of these others. Other approaches, some of the features of a good theory of change, the activities, the intermediate outcomes and ultimate outcomes, recognising that people are complex, avoiding, which I don't think I have on there, but avoiding what we like to call miracle leaps. I know, let's deliver books to people and that will improve their, the rate of, improve the AEDC, the Australian Early Childhood Development scores when they enter school. It's much more complex than that. Think about dosage. Dosage is about, we run financial literacy courses. So 1,000 people came to our financial literacy course. We would say, and so what? What happens as a result? Is one financial literacy course enough to change people's lives? Measurability, visual clarity, and transparency around assumptions is some features. But I want to take you through this one to finish off this section. This is an actual program, and again, it's going to be a little bit hard to read, but this is an organisation we work, Shelter Housing Action Cairns. They work with predominantly Aboriginal women, predominantly single mums, who have been coming in and out of crisis housing for some time. It's a wonderful part of society that we tend to not look at too much. We had the privilege of going up and working with these women for some time, and it was quite fascinating to work. And what happened over this period of time, we visited frequently. No one could afford to have us up there all the time, unfortunately. But really, we thought, okay, what's happening? Why are these women continuing to come back into crisis housing? Why are they ending up homeless over and over again? And a lot of it came down to really low levels of financial literacy. So we said, well, what about if we actually bring them into crisis housing, but while they're in the housing, they are given some culturally appropriate financial literacy development work, and we work with them to develop, SHAC works with them, we don't work with some great people, the My Money workers work with them, to increase, and we thought, okay, well, it's obviously, well, they're going to increase financial literacy, and that's going to mean that they can get more control of their personal finances, and that means that they'll be in a better financial position, and that'll give them long-term resilient housing and so on. That's what we thought would happen. But then you do a bit more work and you go, well, actually what's happening is that, that's not going to work, is it? They do increase financial literacy and take control, but also the My Money work is doing some direct intervention with payday lenders and doing some negotiation on their behalf. That doesn't increase their financial literacy, but what it does do is improve their financial position, so you start to map that out. And you go on, and then we realise, but actually there's some people that aren't even engaging. There's a real magic point here when people say, you lay out, or the My Money worker lays out the figures in front of them, and they say, that's your financial position. Centrelink's giving you $2,000 a month, and they say, no. Centrelink gives me $200 a month, and we go, no, it's $2,000 a month, and they say, well, no, I only get $200, and that's because of all the centre pay arrangements that people have been preying on in the communities. I don't know if you're about Rent-a-Roo and organisations like that pull up with trucks in Aboriginal communities and say, hey, do you want a free fridge? And well, not a free fridge, they say, do you want a fridge? You've just got to sign this, and they sign a centre pay agreement, and all their money gets taken away, and they end up not being able to live. And this has been kind of accepted, and by the way, still being that sector is still actively lobbying government to fight against the restrictions that are being sought to be brought on the fringe lending sector, and it's really it's that lack of visibility and that lack of vision of really what misery is being outsourced because of these kind of practices. Another family paid $15,000 for their family photos that they got taken in a shopping centre, and they didn't realise. And just these low levels of financial literacy just means that they are vulnerable to certain practices. But anyway, so we go through a whole process, and we kind of work out, and I won't sort of take you right through it, but it was quite a fascinating piece to when you really start to dig and really interrogate and go beyond the sticky notes on the wall kind of, this is what I think happens and this is what I think happened, but really working with the stakeholders to more really fully understand what's actually going on and base your measurement on that and really develop a sophisticated theory of change. I cannot explain how important that is. And that's how it finished up, but don't worry. The second thing is, you can look at the report, by the way. If you look up Fair Finance Australia, SROI, you'll find the social return on investment there. Oh, sorry, SHAC. It's also on our website. Stakeholders. This was a really interesting little thing. This is actually also part of that SHAC program. This is a statistical construct of the people that we were working with. And it's quite an interesting thing to do when you go, okay, I'm a single Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mum. 80% of people associate with that statement. And I do not like where my life is going at the moment. 68% of people. I have 3 children who have poor or very poor attendance at school. It's over half of them. In the past year, I've moved home between 2 and 5 times in the past year. That's 89% of them. And I rely on fringe and payday lenders to manage my budget, 74%. I am not confident I can ever afford a home, 64%, and I need emergency relief vouchers to live, 63%. I do not have a good relationship with money. That's turned out to be a really interesting part of this, 64%, and never have spare money to spend how I'd like, and I don't like planning for the future. So we know a little bit more about this group other than they are homeless Aboriginal women, which is kind of how the government programs and others were kind of approaching them at the time. That's one of the things we do. The other thing we do is actually film. And I'm going to show you a 4-minute film now, which we took in a mental health facility in Perth. We were over there working with some people. We spent a week living with them. We spent the first couple of days, by the way, just with cameras pointed at trees and things, and people saying, you know, what are you doing? And we said, oh, look, we're here to talk to you. We want to hear from you. And they, oh, I could never talk to you on camera. Of course, by the end of the week, they were just dying to share their stories. And the stories were quite fascinating. They're stories of change. And this is what we mean by outcomes. When you to understand what you're going to see is 3 people talking about their circumstances before coming to this place and their circumstances after coming to this place. The place is called Emmaus, by the way. You'll hear them say Emmaus. And if we've got time, we might just chat about what you see as the outcomes that they've experienced.
Was diagnosed with mental illness 22 years ago and spent the last 18 years in and out of hospitals every month. First of all, they diagnosed me with schizophrenia, then they diagnosed me with borderline personality disorder, and really they didn't know what to do with me. I was overdosing every month. They just didn't know what to do with me.
There was one time I went up to the nurse and I said to her, I need someone to talk to. I'm feeling suicidal. I feel like I'm going to self-harm. I'm feeling really bad mentally. And she took me straight over to the locked ward. She had me take my clothes off to check that I wasn't hiding like a piece of broken glass or a razor or something on me. She took my bra off me, she took my shoelaces off me, she looked through all my things, and she said, "You're here now." And she just left me there. She didn't talk to me. No one came and sat down and talked to me. They just gave me a dose of an antipsychotic drug called Meloril, which made me extremely tired. They just knocked me out with drugs and
one of my first admissions was to Heathcote, which is closed down now. And in there, I was in the locked ward. God, it was like being in hell. We were in a little room, 20 of us, smoking, no ventilation. They didn't let us out into the yard for 2 weeks. It was just... There was this huge guy in there, and he wanted to smash my brains out. I was really sick, but I had enough wit to tell him, okay, we'll fight like the professionals do when they're training. And he goes, oh, well, a bit of a little slow, big bloke, and do that. He's going to kill me. This guy's like 6 foot 5. Anyway, I said, yeah, they fight in slow motion. So I said, so I'll throw a punch at you, and when it hits your chin, you slowly go back. So I threw this punch like this, that's slow. He's looking at my fist, hits his chin, and then he went, and started to slowly go back like that. And we were doing this for hours, and it saved my life. Slowly.
I've spent the last 2 years since I've been living here without going to hospital.
I've never experienced this before until I came here, where I felt I could genuinely be me, and that is completely okay. In my 32 years, I've always felt around my friends and around society, if they ask me, how are you? I would say, I'm fine, I'm okay, even if I felt like I was dying inside. But if someone here asked me, Kerry, are you okay? I know I can answer truthfully.
past, Dad's passed, you know, like, I need sanctuary, you know. He couldn't understand what I was trying to say. Because way back then, nobody really knew about mental illness much that I knew. So they were sort of just writing me off, especially my friends. They left me for dead. But when I came here, my life really started to change, and I started to paint, draw. I can honestly say that mate has just saved my life.
Helen, Kerry and John, those three people, they actually really clearly and really articulately described, you know, some health and well-being outcomes, some, you know, acceptance and inclusion outcomes, and constructive use of time and some other things. So it's just one of the ways that using the voice of the stakeholder to get really close to what the actual outcomes are. By the way, we also interviewed the state psychiatrists and some of their psychiatrists that they've been in. And I've got to say, these guys made far more sense than the psychiatric sector, and we could have been very cruel in the edit and actually done a real job on the way that the psychiatric sector works. It is described by many people that are in it as quite veterinarian. We have this kind of lock them down, you know, just kind of approach to it. Very inhuman. And it makes you wonder, by the way, you know, what are the circumstances that lead to a psychiatric sector or fringe lenders or housing or gambling, and what is it that's allowed us to think that that's actually okay to outsource or externalise, as an economist would say, the misery to other people in the pursuit of profit to drive that inequity that we saw in some of those earlier charts. That's the stuff that we've got to kind of get our head around, and that's the role of social impact measurement. So I said I would look at creating change that lasts. How do we actually look at outcomes as not as a list of stuff that we can find evidence that we do, but really as a system, an interactive system, and we've kind of realised we talk about this about enduring impact. How do you stop people backsliding? And the first thing we discovered is that if you combine intrinsic, you know, confidence kind of outcomes together with what we call extrinsic, that's the belonging, community, culture, peers, networks, mentoring kind of stuff, together with the functional outcomes, skills, access to knowledge, financial support, whatever, it's only by combining those three things that you can actually create change that lasts. If you only change one of those things, especially in AOD, and alcohol and drug and stuff like that, if you sort of build someone's confidence, as soon as they have a crisis, they backslide. If they've got peers who are having a negative influence on them, then they will backslide. If they don't have the skills, the functional skills, they will backslide. Same with employment, same with a whole bunch of other things. And at the same time, as if we can actually build community outcomes, this is on a systemic level, community outcomes, supportive and equitable policy and economy and a workplace that is more participatory, one that actually employs people from all backgrounds, all abilities. We do some disability stuff as well, and it's really interesting when you look at employers who actually don't employ people who are disabled in some way with a deficit mentality, but employ them as diverse human beings, as we all are. It's amazing what happens to both the people and the organisation. There's a theatre company, by the way, called Back to Back Theatre. If you haven't seen it, based in Geelong. They're known in New York, they're known in Europe, but we don't know them here. They're stunning work. Anyway, and I was going to give you a few case studies on that, but I think I might just skip through them. That just illustrates, there's just case studies that illustrate what happens when you only focus on one or two of those outcomes areas. So the simple premise here, and the thing to think about when you're designing your organisations, and I would love for you to go back and actually ask and have a look at, is that people who experience intrinsic outcomes, like improved confidence and self-esteem and others, combined with extrinsic outcomes, which are supportive peers and mentors and belonging to community and culture and other things. And functional outcomes like new skills are more likely to experience enduring impact. So have a look at your stakeholders, your beneficiary stakeholders, and see how well your organisation is delivering on those 3 areas. It's a really simple little acid test to work out. So think about esteem, identity, confidence and belief, belonging, community, culture and peers, and skills, access to services and capability and knowledge. And it's just a nice way, and feel free to evolve it. That's, by the way, what's being spoken about in more detail in Istanbul. Now, the reason I showed you those little 3 case studies I was going to, because I wanted to actually show you some real data that actually says, well, what happens? Can you measure these things? Can you measure capability, skills, aspirations? Aspirations are really important, by the way, especially in youth programs. If someone grows up believing their life looks like this, and here's my possibilities in my life, and a program comes along and expands those aspirations, it is immensely powerful. We now have the capabilities to measure those things and report on that. So that was what Sarah's profile, that's Nathan's profile, and that was Frank's profile. Names changed, by the way. So we've now got the tools emerging to actually measure these non-financial outcomes and actually report on them in ways that really helps you engage with policymakers and funders and others in a more meaningful way. There are a couple of tools that we use, RBA and SROI, but we're not slaves to those methodologies, but we draw on the best of them these are now being used globally. To be honest, I think the world is still in kindergarten in social impact measurement. We've been measuring financial outcomes. The Collins and Co people, they can measure the performance of a company on about 1,000 different ratios, I'm sure. But just like in financial accounting, if another accounting firm measured, because it's a principles-based approach, financial accounting as well, you could actually come up with different profit figures and different other figures for measuring a company's performance, yet we believe those things quite solidly. Social accounting is probably a little less exact than that, but getting closer. And I'm not going to go through too much. Oh yeah, I do want to put a couple of things. Indicators. People say, yeah, what are the indicators? How do you know? And I just love these 2 little ideas. There's a poet from the 1800s, I think, who has seen the wind, neither you or I, but where the trees bow down their heads, the wind is passing by. And it's a great analogy for indicators. Don't look at measuring the actual thing you're trying to measure, but, if someone's kind of confidence is low or improving, what other ways might you measure that that's changing? And we can talk about that ad nauseum, but there are ways of using that kind of approach. And the other thing is it's better to have approximate information about important issues rather than be exact about what may turn out to be trivial. So make sure you're measuring the right thing. Also, really cool tool, I want to credit Triangle Consulting. By the way, speaking of credit, it's one of my little bugbears that people take stuff and don't credit it to people. The earlier presentation on Impact Planning Canvas, that belongs to Strategizer. They should be acknowledged for that. And the Ask Izzy app is developed by who was it? Disruptive Media, that's right. There's some great things, but I really believe that people are putting a lot of work into this stuff. What this is, an outcome star, this is an employment outcome star. Those dimensions of the star simply say, what does it take to get someone back into employment? It takes mental health, it takes drug and alcohol misuse being minimised, it takes social inclusion, it takes managing your tenancy, it takes self-care and living skills, and a whole bunch of things. That's what's on the outside of the star. That coloured scale down the right corresponds to that little 10-point scale within them. So we can actually now, using language, if someone says, I don't give a shit, why should I stop using drugs? No one gives a damn about me anyway. Well, that's classic stuck behaviour at 1 or 2. Very different conversation to, well, I'd get off this stuff if someone would give me a hand. That's a 3 or 4, that's guided first steps. So we use language to turn that into quantified change and use that to drive things. And just quickly to finish, engaging the ecosystem. Don't just use social impact measurement to raise funds, although it is useful for that, but really use it to question your purpose and re-examine your purpose, your stated purpose, to measure the effectiveness of your organisation, to decide whether you've got the right programs in place, to support collaboration, not to limit it, certainly to engage policy supporters, and most importantly, especially in the current political climate, government is really receptive to evidence-based policy and all those things. So the more evidence that you can provide, you can have a much more equal conversation, and we're no longer approaching this stuff from being a mendicant who's reliant on charity, but being a master of change. And on that, I will finish. Thank you. Any questions? We got time? No? Yep. Any questions? Seriously? You'd be the first. Okay. Yep. Yeah, sure.
In the similar conversation that I had with James,
Yep.
when you've understood that an organisation has not really taken the time over the last 10 years to look at measurement, social impact, and how do you communicate that back, where's a great place to start?
Usually we would do two things. One is a theory of change kind of workshop, and really we have a process we take people through to actually examine the causal links and actually connect what activities they're doing with what their stated intended impact is. And the second thing is to develop what we describe as an impact framework, which is really just a larger structure for identifying the domains of change that you think you're creating value in, and then we can go into in more detail and start to, the next step after that is to actually identify specific outcomes by engaging with the stakeholders. That's always that's where the rubber hits the road. Is an organisation says, "Oh, we do great stuff. We save polar bears by sprinkling glitter on the ocean to reflect the sunlight, and that stops the ice melting." And
We do.
No. Actually, that was one of the ideas in the 50s, apparently, just to battle climate change. But that's what we do, and so we save polar bears. And then you ask the fundamental question, okay, what other ways can you save polar bears? What are the kind of causal, what are the things that are causing polar bear populations to diminish or suffer? I don't know why, I'm not talking, we never work on polar bears. But it's a nice agnostic example. But yeah, and then you work backwards from there. We do what's called a reverse outcomes approach to program design, and we start to identify, wow, actually we could make a difference if we actually did these things, not the current things that we're doing, or less of the current things and more of these things. Then you develop a strategy and a business plan to actually transition the organisation from one to the other, and that's basically the impact-led design approach. Sounds easy.
And can I ask, is there a way that you've found, once you've developed those sort of tools, have you been able to measure the effectiveness of the communication of that social impact that you've identified?
Well, it depends on what you mean by effectiveness. We always think of effectiveness in terms of actually change experienced by the intended beneficiaries, not benefit to the organisation. So we approach it a little bit different to business strategists and so on. But this is stuff we're doing currently with Red Cross. We're doing it with United Way, with Les Twentyman and his work, and a whole bunch of other, and some of the government departments are going through this at the moment as well. That's probably going to be a longer change piece, I suspect. Okay.
How does changing to that model impact funding?
Sorry?
How does changing to measuring impact, having that impact-driven approach, how does it change the way funding has to work?
Invariably, once the emphasis comes off raising funds and trying to kind of demonstrate that you're effective to get funds, and you actually become effective at actually articulating impact. In every single case, with every client we've ever worked with, the funding starts to just increase as a kind of almost as a natural thing, because at the moment there is a massive demand for amongst philanthropists, amongst corporate grants and others, and amongst government funding to actually, they call it commissioning for outcomes now. So how you actually close the gap between the funding that's available and the outcomes that are being generated. So it does, and one of the other things someone else talked about earlier, by the way, is culture, how the culture changes at the same time. It does mean that the organisation starts to change. It does mean that old ways sometimes have to go. It does cause pain for people. As I say, a lot of people are in these organisations because they care deeply about the cause and deeply about their area of expertise in that cause. And that's one of the things that we notice the most is the challenge and the importance of bringing people along that journey with you. And there's a whole bunch of organisational change stuff that sits behind that.
So I come from an engineering background, so I'm going to ask, do you have numbers around that, like the impact to funding models and everything after you implement this change?
Yep. So you're an engineer. Some of my colleagues are engineers. Some of my best friends are engineers too, actually. The funding model. Okay, we start with the impact model. So the impact model is a very organised systemic thing. So you actually identify the number of stakeholders you're working with, you actually identify the outcomes. We know through research the degree to which those outcomes are achieved. We value those things, we discount for what would have happened otherwise, we discount for what we call dead weight and attribution, and who else is contributing to the change. So it's quite a sophisticated approach that actually engineers really appreciate when they realise, oh yeah, this actually does equate to this human experience I'm having over here, and now I've got a spreadsheet that demonstrates it, and that's at the core of it. But the funding, the trick with the funding and the funding aspect of that is then how you can then develop things like impact prospectuses to actually go to funders and say, don't give us money because you've got a $20,000 grant. Don't kind of, because we're poor, partner with us in actually creating this change because we know how to create this change. We can demonstrate we're effective in creating it. So partner with us on that, and you can share the pleasure of doing that as well, and the other benefits that come to them from doing it. The whole impact investing market, I'm sure you're aware of. There's new funding instruments coming out, social impact bonds now, that people are getting paid on the basis of outcomes they generate rather than just donations. Reusable philanthropy, social enterprise, it's all changing very fast. Thank you.